I think Europe has been dying for a long time, frankly. There has been an incremental number of attempts to revive and save and rescue the Union, but ultimately all those attempts have failed to address the key thing that is ailing Europe. And that is that it doesn't know what it should be. And I think that's why you're hearing Macron going around going, if we don't do this, Europe will die. And by die, it means the end of the European Union experiment.
Welcome to the Microscopic Podcast presented by GoldRepublic. My name is Alexej, and in this format I invite you to look at the world through different lenses, to see what's hidden in plain sight. We'll dive deep to understand the forces that drive macroeconomics, financial markets, and the emergence of a new monetary system with sound money like gold, silver, and digital assets like Bitcoin. We'll also investigate how geopolitics and power games shape the world we live in, but also what can we learn from history to understand the present and prepare for the future. I hope you will get fresh insight and enjoy this conversation. If you do, as always, please give it a like and subscribe, but also leave your actions down below in the comment section and share it to those who need to hear this. But before I start, I'd like you to know that if you open an account at GoldRepublic, you will receive 1 free gram of gold. Just click on the link in the description. Today I have Izabella Kaminska. It's great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I've actually got a recommendation by Bart Brands, my colleague who met you at the LBMA in Lisbon, and he just could not stop talking about you. He loved you.
Oh, that's very kind. He's very memorable. I do remember him.
And obviously it's for a reason, and that's also one of the reasons why we're recording this podcast today. So it's the first time I have you on the show, and it's also always good to have a bit of background. And if you could obviously give a bit of an overview and introduction about yourself for the viewers, and also as a follow-up question to that, tell us what is the most heretical thought or idea that you have about the monetary system today.
You put me on the spot. So I'm Izabella Kaminska, and I am a journalist. I've been a journalist all my life. I've been all over the place being a journalist. I started off not really knowing what type of journalist I want to be. So for a while, I wanted to be a war correspondent, and I did crazy things like go to Afghanistan off my own back and try and do freelancing there. And then I realized that was probably not a good idea, and I frightened myself a little bit. And I also got a distaste for the sort of war tourism thing that I kind of felt was happening in some quarters by journalists. So I ended up focusing on finance and spent a long time at the FT, 13 years being on Alphaville or head of Alphaville. I also had a column at the FT, and I think most people know me from that. And then in 2022, I left the FT and I decided to go solo, and I started my own thing, The Blind Spot, which, at the time it was like a incredibly at the time, a lot of people were doing the same thing, and they were all going to Substack. I decided to go and do it my own way, not on Substack, just because I didn't want to be like everybody else. Sorry about I forgot to turn off my notifications. But yeah, so I decided to do it differently and in a more complex way. But the Blind Spot was it's still going. It is still a thing. But I think I underestimated how hard it is to launch a independent media beyond sort of a Substack. And I think it was going well, and I had some good traction. But unfortunately, for personal reasons, due to sudden family income from 2 steady incomes to 0 steady incomes, was approached by Politico to join them, and I thought, well, I need a steady income, and actually I can do with a protectorate again. And this ended up being a really good thing, I think, because there are real downsides to being totally on your own. And so now I have a hybrid situation where I work for Politico most pretty much full time, and then I do 1 day a week on the blind spot. And we have this nice cooperation. So I'm like, I have a foot in the independent media space, my project where I can say whatever I want. And on the other side, I still am plugged into the so-called MSM. And I think it's a nice balance, because if you go totally independent, you can go a bit, tribal. Whereas you're very susceptible to being captured by audiences, I would say. Whereas, there are elements of the mainstream, system that are incredibly proficient and very good for ensuring quality control. So it's good to have a check on the worst parts of yourself in some ways. So that is what I am doing now. And in terms of the most controversial kind of thing I think about the monetary system,
Heretical point of view.
heretical, the monetary system. Gosh, that is a very good question. Well, I mean, I don't know if it's heretical or not, but I always think of money as a rationing system. And it's about allocating goods and services according to demand and supply. And my heretical view is that in the technology age, we are moving more into the sphere where money itself might be eliminated. At least there will be, I think, a lot of pressure on the monetary system to move in that direction through algorithms and what I call sort of AI GOS plan, by which I mean a second coming of the original GOS plan that you saw in the Soviet Union. And when AI can sort of allocate resources totally, bilaterally between whoever needs it, you might not need the medium of exchange at all. I think that is the risk further down the road. And whether or not it is a good thing really depends on how you feel about outsourcing a lot of that control to a singular AI system.
Okay. So at some point in time, if I understood it correctly, AIs will interact with each other and will see us as things to manage. And
exactly. But in terms of that's the future kind of heretical. It's not heretical, because I think heretical in that norm would be saying maybe we should resist that. Whereas heretical today, my big new idea is I think the financial system, the monetary system, is actually maybe a 2-tier system. That's my big new insight. I think there are 2 rates of monetary rates in the system. One is the sort of rate for what I would call the transparent economy, and then there's a rate for the purple or black economy, which I had never really appreciated was a thing, but I do think it's a thing. I think we've learned more about that now with the emergence of ESG and this idea of, there being a different funding rate for ESG worthy stocks and investments versus blacklisted ones that we can't invest in, right? So there's a 2-tier rate system. And I think we're going increasingly more, I think it's going to become more transparent what is and isn't the form of financial repression, or one part of the market is repressed. But at the same time, just like you get in most parallel economies, like in Iran, or where there is real suppression, you get 2 not monetary rates, but like FX rates. You might have like the official dollar rate, and then you might have the unofficial dollar rate. And my hunch is that maybe we've had an unofficial rate a lot longer than I appreciated in our own Western systems. And
a bit like because I had an interview with Farida, which is a human rights activist from Togo, and we were talking about the franc CFA, and they basically have still rates like the indexing of their salaries from the 60s, even though they got devaluated twice since then. And they also have this, it's also a type of 2-tier system where they're linked and pegged back then to the French franc, which then became the euro and dictated they got their monetary policies and fiscal policies dictated by foreign powers, which is then the case of France.
I did not know that. I did not know that. But you certainly see a debate, mostly coming from the left leaning economists and green focused ones they're pushing the Bank of England to have two different rates, like officially. So one rate for vice stroke polluting stocks and things that are not, in the ESG camp, and then the climate approved sphere. But I think that is going to go, that started off as a climate thing, but I think it's going to move into a new category as well.
And how do you explain that emergence? And what was the moment when you thought that it clicked and you saw the difference, basically?
I think for a while I've been aware of, the push for ESG and how that has been splitting and somewhat repressing the, a loose term might be of the vice economy, but it's not really just vice. It's everything like old, everything from old energy, coal-fired energy, stroke fossil fuels, anything deemed not, everything that is considered against environmental progress, so to speak. And I thought it pretty much, or governance, or, there's also, we're also screening it's not just E, there's S and G. So, good practice, good corporate practice, that sort of stuff. But I think what really made me think about the other rate, maybe there's a triple rate, like the normal rate, the kind of virtue rate, and then the vice rate, is the recent attacks by Israel in Lebanon against the Hezbollah network, with the pages exploding. And what made me realize this was obviously the supply chains that had to feed that. And we don't know the exact details, but if you extrapolate, and having dealt with Wirecard, which was a big fraud back in the FT, not directly, but via my colleagues, Dan McCrum, it does make you wonder if there is a sort of underground rate where there are all these front agencies, a sort of a middle ground, because they're not exactly criminal, because they're fronts that are endorsed and condoned and even licensed in some ways by the state, because if they're being, they're black budget sort of networks, and you can't officially feed that funding through Congress or through any kind of parliamentary transparent system. You have to have a secret source of financing, right? So my hunch is that there is this area of the economy is much bigger than we really appreciated. And I wonder now how we, as like observers of the system who aren't in the know about it, how we can really value companies. So when you see short sellers, identify problematic companies or accusing them of fraud or certain other, accounting irregularities, you never really think, well, maybe those companies are being protected by certain interests, and that's why there are irregularities, right? But if they are being protected, they're de facto state-sponsored enterprises that don't need to, either they have different, secret profit streams or revenue streams that other companies aren't allowed to do, right? So that's still a type of favoritism, or they are being held up by government contract, and, useless government contracts. Maybe you just hire people for the sake of channeling money to these front organizations, but do they actually provide any value? Nobody knows. And I have this feeling that these companies are skewing the marketplace, because then legitimate and honest actors look at these kind of de facto state-sponsored companies and they think, well, they're really successful and their valuations are going up despite like their core business being a bit confusing. We'll emulate those practices, and then this is how I suspect terrible capital misallocation might occur, because you can't compete with those companies not doing that sort of business, because that's not their real business. And I think this I think the main point I'm trying to make is that always was something that I think was considered to be marginal. And I suspect maybe it's not as marginal as we think it is.
Is that maybe a good comparison to, in the monetary perspective for financial markets, comparable to the Eurodollar system?
Not really. I think it's slightly different. Like the Eurodollar system is just, that is like the true free market of money as close as you're going to get, now being replicated by the rise of stablecoins, where, all sorts of companies can raise capital from, a non-close-ended monetary system. Because the point is, if you raise only in America, like the Fed controls the multiplier, but with Eurodollars, the multiplier was pretty much endless. It was totally endogenous for the system. And I think that was, that was the opportunity of Eurodollars. And the funding rate reflected, real supply demand dynamics and profitability potential of all the private sector companies that were coming to raise money from the Eurodollar market. So I don't think it's quite the same. I think it's more, I don't think it's necessary through the monetary side of things. I think it's more that the dual rate comes in through de facto guarantees from the state, right? That is, so think of it like in 2008. Before 2008, we thought there was a proper private sector where if you fail, especially as a bank, you will go down. And what became clear after 2008 was that there was an implicit government guarantee backing all the too big to fail organizations. And now, if you are to be very critical, you could say, is there really a private sector in the banking sphere? If at the sharp end, you could argue that, everyone is state sponsored to some degree, like to what do, even in 2022, when was it? No, 2020, when was the crisis? 2020, last year, 2023, and you saw all these banks getting bailed out again. I mean, not directly, and we let a few of them die for the optics, but by and large, we know there is a safety net that is being funded by the taxpayer, right? And that became now it's explicit, I think. I don't think we can pretend it isn't, but it does mean that the idea we live in a capitalist system, I think, is now clearly being challenged. Like, it is not clear at all. A key function of a capitalist system is allowing companies that don't make money to fail. If you continue to support them for stability reasons or whatever reasons, we're moving more into a planned economy situation or a national banking system in the case of finance.
That's also one of the questions that I wanted to investigate today with you is, where are we heading in Europe? Because we both based here in Europe. You're in London, I'm in Amsterdam. And
on the other side of the Brexit divide.
Exactly. Well, still European though. And Brexit is, of course, like a very good example, because I think a lot of things started then shifting from that moment onwards. But overall, when you look back, I would say that a lot of things started going south since the 2008 crisis, which was kind of the big revelation moment that kind of still marked the big departure from EU's productivity and GDP growth and all kinds of other factors that we are feeling now. And the pain is now written on every tabloid, on every newspaper. Germany's dying man of Europe, the energy crisis, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And maybe we can unpack that, and it would be maybe interesting to kind of like get a full context from your side. But it seems like the question is more, is Europe slowing down or is it slowly dying? And that is kind of the topic I want to address today.
Yes, absolutely. What is going on? I think Europe has been dying for a long time, frankly. And I think there has been a incremental number of attempts to revive and save and rescue the union. But ultimately, all those attempts have failed to address the key thing that is ailing Europe. And that is that it doesn't know what it should be, and that there is a paradox between what Europe is good at. Can you still be Europe if you are entirely integrated? And I don't think you can reconcile it, because for Europe to excel and get out of this stagnating cycle, it would really have to come together on a singular sort of federal basis in terms of obviously fiscal policy, amongst other things. And it would have to abandon its sort of home bias, both in the equity markets and bond markets, finance markets, all sorts of markets, right? But asking, and I'm riffing off of Russell Napier here a bit. He's the first one I heard say this, so I don't want to claim it's my take. That kind of undermines everything that Europe is. Europe is like culture. Like, that is our number one selling point of Europe, is this amazing patchwork of different cultures in a very small geographical area. Obviously, America, all the different states have different cultural identities too, but not to the same degree as we have in Europe. And so really, if you want Europe to compete with the Chinas and the Americas, you're asking it to abandon all those national traits. And every time we've asked Europeans to do that in the past, that has not worked out too well. So I think that's a fundamental paradox. I think we've been trying to have our cake and eat it since the late 70s. And obviously more recently with the launch of the euro, we've definitely been trying to have our cake. I mean, that just kind of made all these contradictions more acute. And so now the Europeans are going to have to make a decision. They're either going to have to come together, as Mario Draghi pointed out when he launched his competitiveness report at the beginning of September. Either we basically do come together and we have to have international, cross-border corporates and corporate champions, etc. Not national champions, but like European Union champions, right? And then we can take on the Googles, etc. Or we will just die. And I think Draghi has said it. I think Macron is being very explicit about what's at stake, because none of those countries are strong enough independently to take on the big sort of giants of China, India coming up, and obviously America. UK is slightly different. The UK's business model, I mean, we are also obviously incredibly challenged. I don't want to suggest we're not, but the UK has a different pathway out of its stagnation. I think it still has certain things going for it that Europeans don't, without the loss of culture. For one thing, the English language makes Britain we have exported that to the world, and culturally, one of the biggest markets in the world is very much, the difference between America and the UK, I think, is less than the difference between the UK and France sometimes. So, or even the Netherlands, right? So I suspect the UK can, in an information economy, in a capital light system, evolve to export goods that mimic at least American goods, if it can. I think the UK can possibly do it better. Whether European countries can independently, I don't think so. And so what does that mean? I mean, that means a massive restructuring of the European Union, and considering internal comparative advantage and where the different zones of Europe should specialize. And we haven't really thought about that for a very long time. A key component, obviously, is also the demise of German industrial power, and this is completely putting the European Union in flux. It was very clear, I think, from 2022 onwards, from the moment of the Ukraine war starting, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that Germany was not going to survive in a system of sanctions. I mean, this is not incredibly insightful. Everybody knows this now, I think. But what does it mean in practice? It means Germany has to find a new specialization. And also now, a point that was made to me by Nicholas Veron is that from the Peterson Institute, I believe, we now have to go where the power is, in terms of not political power, but in terms of actual energy power, right? So we could ship in power before, but now in a renewable and clean environment energy grid, it'll be the hydropower centers or the solar centers that will have an advantage, and they will woo industry to them, because industry, whatever industry remains, wants to be near the energy source. And Germany's not really cut out to attract any industry based on any of those fronts. So what we do about Germany is it's a big challenge for Europe. And you can see this now playing out with I don't know how much you've been following, that UniCredit has now made a move for Commerzbank, and Commerzbank, the Germans are very much resisting this for many reasons, but national pride amongst them. You don't want to be owned by the Italians if you're German. But it's also ironic that in some ways the reason UniCredit has become so much more of a healthy bank than Commerzbank can afford to do this is because of the indirect state support, ECB support for Italian bonds. So you've got, it's all going around in a big circle. So now that is undermined as well. And the Germans have a point here. It's like, we can't really allow this merger to go ahead because we still have national insurance deposit guarantee schemes. We don't have a universal European Union deposit scheme. So if a cross-border bank goes down, how do you manage the resolution of that bank? Like, how do you do it? Who would have to guarantee which depositors? How would you do it? So I think it is a pickle. That's not very insightful, but my big idea is really that we are at a point like the Soviet Union was in 1988, where it's becoming self-evident that the system is not working and a massive restructuring is needed. And how that restructuring will look is the question in hand. And of course, everyone has a view on that. Everybody has a view. Back even in the Soviet Union, lots of people didn't want perestroika. Lots of people didn't want more market reform. And some people just wanted more communism, right? So you're never, when there's a kind of moment of realization that the old system is not working anymore, you have to kind of, it's kind of shaming in some ways to admit it. You have to lose face in the global, geopolitical context, like, oops, we've been doing this thing that doesn't work at all. We're going to have to totally restructure. But you also have to fight it out over the different factions who want different things. And in somewhere like Brussels, where it takes an eternity to get anything through because there's, effectively 1,000 opinions for every single bit of legislation, the technocrats always prevail because they have to. And so this is why Draghi is the man that has been sort of championed for the job to restructure Europe, which is kind of crazy in some ways, but he is, and I don't know how much
whatever it takes.
Yeah, whatever it takes. He's done it before and now he's going to do it again. And a lot of people are still very cynical that he's written this report and he has some ideas about how to save Europe. They're cynical that anything can go through at the Brussels legislative end because of the constant bickering, right? And people talk and nothing ever happens. And common debt, is a big issue within that, especially. But I think this time is different. And I think that's why you're hearing Macron going around going, if we don't do this, Europe will die. And by die, it means the end of the European Union experiment.
And you just said it is indeed an experiment. But it's an experiment that might be very costly for a lot of people too. The question is now, if we focus, for example, more on the manufacturing side of things, if we look at purely on the manufacturing side, we see that you mentioned before that one of the solutions for Europe's maybe, a salvage, I would say, is to specialize economies. But that would also mean that if we look at, for example, Germany, which is basically the powertrain of Europe in a manufacturing perspective, Germany has been doing cars for quite some time, and they've been known for their premium cars. But even that industry now is threatened by high energy costs, by relocation of productions. We've seen like more than almost 10% of small and medium-sized enterprises that wanted to relocate actually outside of Germany. And on top of that, to make it even better, the US played its move quite well, because not only did they supply gas across the Atlantic, but they've also enticed some of those big companies to relocate to the United States. So it's kind of ironic in the end to see how, if we look at the grand scheme of things with, of course, the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and by that I mean the conflict between Israel and Lebanon, Palestine, and Iran, is that, Europe is burning and someone is benefiting from this. But in the meantime, we're still under the shackles of our quote-unquote allies, which kind of profit from all that. And this is just one example. There are, I think, many more. So in the end, there's the political will, but are the right leaders also equipped with what it takes, or whatever it takes, to make that move?
Which move? The move
to revitalize Europe.
Revitalize Germany,
and
revitalize the European Union.
Germany is a component to, I would say, the European Union. So that is just one aspect of it. Also, the discrepancies between, for example, energy policy. So France being a very nuclear energy-driven country, which got banned in Germany, which they don't want to see at all. And they dismantled their whole coal industry. And now the whole idea of renewable energies, which is then dependent on production on China, which they started now a trade war with, it just all seems a bit like very absurd, actually, to me. So,
I mean, more broadly, and I don't know if this really answers your question, but I think more broadly, there are lots of different people out there who think they have the solution for what you need to do, right? And some of them, quite a large chunk of them, now think, actually, we have to become more like China. And this is the only way we can compete, because unfortunately, China will not play by the rules. And, we invited them to the, World Trade Organization, and we were all going to be friends and engage in this sort of very dynamic trade policy, right? But China, if you really think about it, was kind of breaking all the rules from day one. And we kind of let that slip because we knew that China had to grow, and we knew that it had to attract investment. And a strong China, you want to some degree develop China and have it be part of our system rather than a communist system. So the idea was that as it grows and gets wealthier, it'll want to become more capitalistic and free and join us in that game. But actually, as we now know, that isn't what happened, and China has kind of emerged as a player that seems, in many people's eyes, as a superior economic model, because even if, whatever you say, it's delivered all this growth, and look at the fantastic technology, look at the EVs, look what a command economy to some degree can achieve, where it was Europe is squabbling and the UK is fighting over Brexit, and the Americans are being distracted by Trump. Like over here, we have this massive sort of power base, and all because they don't have to take any, dissent from anybody. They can just tell people what to do to some degree. And there is this, I think it was Louis Gav that was saying the other day that you have this immense competition at the sort of short end of the Chinese economy, where there are loads of bankruptcies all the time, and all these, in some ways, they're incredibly capitalistic and ruthless, right? And he was arguing that, maybe they've become more capitalistic than us in some ways. Now, my take is slightly different in that I think We just haven't. China has kind of exported its ailments to us, and we think that it is doing a good thing because it's generated all this growth, which is great. But I think a lot of that growth is stolen from us, right? We let it happen. It's because we allowed China to, if we had been ruthless ourselves, that would have never happened. It's because we invested in China. It's because we allowed it to kind of debase its currency and compete with us, like effectively do QE for many years before even QE was a thing, right? And get that advantage. And the idea was we'd tolerate it as long as they finally joined the club. But when that moment came, they were like, no, we think our way is superior. And this is the great sort of debate at the moment. Is it superior or is it a mirage? Is it a mirage? Is it actually, can it sustain itself? Can it work without being part of the global economy and drawing on the teat of the West? And I don't think it can. I don't think it can survive. That's why it cannot decouple without massive deflation. And you see, the problem is when your main comparative advantage is cheap labor, you can't allow your own people to really go up the wealth ladder as much as you could do in a capitalistic society, because your system depends on some level of slave labor, effectively. Now, there has been a lot of like social mobility in China, don't get me wrong. But when you look at the figures, like when you see that the average, GDP per head in America is close to $80,000, and it's something like $10,000 in China. Like we're on a completely different sort of spectrum. And so if they abandon using cheap labor as their main comparative advantage, my view is they would have to compete on the same stuff we compete on, which is technology and finished goods and IP. And that is not, there's no guarantee there that they would generate those surpluses, because suddenly they're competing with us on our level, because it's not, we don't want to compete on cheap labor. That's not our thing. That's their thing. And so the chances are, you'll still grow on that level, but you'll never close the gap, right? So once you, that was the whole point of this cheap labor thing, was about closing the gap. And I don't think China's prepared to go up like that with the rest of the economy, right? It wants to go like that. And so that's really Thatcher, that famous Thatcher speech where she's like this. And I think this is what is confusing a lot of people who think that actually the model itself works. I don't think the model works at all. That's my hunch. And there is a grave mistake in trying to become more like China. That said, I can understand there's a third camp of people who think because things got so skewed in the international economy because of China de facto cheating, we now have to impose temporarily certain sort of more command economy-esque industrial policy to get us back to recover the essential parts of our economy that we unfortunately hollowed out because of thinking that China would become more like us. Now it turns out we can't trust China at all, so we have to bring in our supply chains. There are certain national security things and sectors that we have to protect and recultivate, right? So that, and to do that, and to make sure we don't lose our entire, car industry or whatever to China, we now have to be a bit protectionist. And so I think that's what's happening now. But that's very different. So those are three camps. You've got the camp of no protection, and we just continue to compete, in a free market. Well, I tend to think that is a race to the bottom for the West, because China will continue to undercut its way wherever it feels there's a strategic industry to disrupt, right? Whenever we get ahead, it will either steal our IP or whatever. Then there's the camp that says we become more like China. I don't think that's right. And then there's the middle ground, which is temporarily we should become a bit more protectionist, but only with a view to eventually outcompeting China, protecting our industries, and sorting out our stagnation problem.
So what do you think is the most plausible outcome, and what of those three options would most likely be the direction that EU leadership will take?
So I think Draghi is trying to have like the middle ground. I think he is trying to be as industrial policy led as you can be within a market system, but he acknowledges that you have to put up some gates. And he's trying to compensate for the kind of protectionism on the European Union front by increasing domestic competition and allowing getting the internal barriers to drop down instead, right? That's his big idea. But as I said at the beginning, I think there's a fundamental problem with that because it ignores that one of Europe's biggest comparative advantages has nothing to do with efficiency. Okay. So the Draghi vision is all about increasing productivity and creating wealth that way. And that is fine. But by doing that, you erode what makes Europe special. And what makes Europe special is actually that its prime comparative advantage in the global economy is what I call inefficiency as a service. That means goods. That means, we like Disneyland. We are this is where we're the cradle of civilization in some ways. And if we undermine that historical significance, we stand to lose a lot because then, France will not be France, Germany will not be Germany. We will all become like America, where even if there is a national profile and certain preferences, overall, everyone gets the same cheeseburger, right? So I think that is the main issue. In some ways, you might even consider that Europe should just give up trying to compete in many areas. Well, Draghi says that to some degree. Like he does say some sectors, forget about it. We're never gonna win this. Like stop even trying. But I think what is neglected is that you can't have productivity gains in the luxury goods sector. You just can't, because by definition, luxury has to be done by hand. I mean, the whole point is it's a cultural good. So if if we are exporting cultural goods, we become more like the Maasai in Kenya. We become like a people who live on a national reservation who have to be protected because we want to protect those cultural norms, right? Because they're important for society. And that means hyper wealth is gone, but it's replaced maybe with just a nice life for everybody.
Which is kind of like the lifestyle. And also you see this in the life expectancy compared to across the world. Europe has the best work-life balance, life expectancy, there's the quality of life. And here in Amsterdam, I cannot complain. That's also one of the reasons I'm living here, is because it's nice. But nice also stops somewhere where you cannot fund anymore this type of lifestyle. And Europe has been maybe capitalized on this for quite a few decades, and now it looks like those reserves are falling short. And maybe, and that's my question to you, is this enough? I mean, in a future where we talk about AI, defense, high-tech technology, and energy independency, are we then just going to be an open-air museum?
Well, I mean, we might be. I mean, you want to get the mix right, and you want to, and this is, not, it's an area I don't necessarily like to talk about because I don't feel, it's problematic. Like the immigration issue becomes key here because if we are, at the moment we need immigrations to sustain the model that we have because we are not procreating enough to ensure there are enough Europeans doing those crappy jobs, right? Which is a brutal way of saying it, but that is the reason why we are and have historically tolerated immigration that is not culturally necessarily aligned, right? So but now there's a downside or sort of paradox to that, is that if you have too much immigration that is not culturally aligned, you undermine your cultural exports because you're no longer, you might as well become European and have the kind of European cheeseburger because you're not, France is also not France if its culture totally changes because of mass immigration from different cultures or religious backdrops, right? So these are kind of like, I don't have the answers, but these are the trade-offs that Europe has to contend with. And if it wants to maintain national identity, and if it wants to maintain that as an exportable good, then it has to start creating Europeans, which means increasing the birth rate, which at the moment is not going to happen because of other cultural norms that aren't necessarily even European cultural norms, but they're kind of progressive norms, which have allowed for, women in the workplace. And to some, I'm a woman in the workplace, but it does undermine your ability to have children. It is just a fact. So these are the sort of decisions we have to think about. If we think of ourselves as an endangered sort of Maasai species, one of the key things is like maintaining the birth rate. But we don't think like that because it's taboo to think like that. But if we don't, then we become, and I'm not endorsing it. I have no idea. I'm just putting it out there in terms of my analytical overview of how I see things evolving. But I think if we don't do that, then we become vassals of some other culture. It's inevitable because we cannot survive independently without it. Or we have to become like this big amoeba, this European Union amoeba, which is possible as well. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I don't think personally the Germans or the Poles, are going to go for it.
But it's a bit of a puzzle because on one side, the dropping birth rates have been dropping, especially since actually 2008, and mainly due, I can imagine, to the austerity programs that were put in place, and then also that, if I understood correctly, also lack of then investment into innovation and all that basically took the edge away of already quite a blunt European knife, and into this basically negative death spiral of then lower birth rates, lower productivity, lower demographics, and lower GDP and all that, and so on and so forth. And then with also then the social tensions, and immigration is one of the pain points that we've seen also, that a lot of far-right parties or groups reemphasize on and on in many countries, in most important countries in Europe, actually, that then also creates social divide and tension. So it's a bit of a quagmire.
It is a quagmire. Let's hypothesize and say Draghi gets what he wants, which is like we massively improve productivity through some sort of technological means, right? Well, what does that Europe look like? That looks like a fully automated Europe. That looks like a Europe where the farmers have been displaced with robots. And, the French brasseries, the waiters are also robots, Is that also a future we want? That's what you need if you want to fill the birth gap. You have to outsource to somebody. And it's a pickle because I don't think that's necessarily what you want either. But if you want to sustain a higher, higher quality of life, we're going to have to make automation a norm somewhere.
Would that also maybe imply, because you've mentioned that, the federalization of Europe, and that's kind of something that I just hear since like I've started studying about the European Union a decade ago, and I realized that maybe now is the moment for the federalists to come into the spotlight and say, hey, we need to reform Europe, and giving it more actually centralized powers, more than it has now, and go towards, as you mentioned then before, like the China model, and have more of a control economy, and basically having someone with a fist on the table banging and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do.
I don't know, but if that centralization happens, it has to happen in a way like Epcot Center. Like it has to be, you have to have all your different zones of different cultural norms, and that is never going to be hyper efficient, because if you have, German breakfasts are not going to sell as plentifully in France as they do in Germany. That's just a matter of culture. So by definition, if you have too much variation across Europe, you undermine efficiency no matter what. So if you want efficiency, everybody has to be eating the same sausage everywhere, right? It's the nature of the system. Can you have, boutique cultural preservation zones. Maybe that's the way to do it. Maybe by and large, everything else, goes to a norm, like you do in America to some degree. But everything is fundamentally centralized. I don't know what the solution is. I think we want to have our cake and eat it, which is access to nice houses, nice way of life. Everyone wants their kids to have a good education. Everyone wants to have access to services. Will we, I worry about AI. What I worry about AI is that we are targeting the wrong jobs for displacement. Because those are sort of nice quality jobs that you want to retain. You don't necessarily want to make your elites entirely. I mean, some elites, I'm quite happy to downsize the number of lawyers in the world. I don't think we need as many lawyers as there are. Sorry if there are any lawyers listening. I mean, certainly there is, I'm going to hedge that, because one of the reasons productivity is being kind of held back, I think, is because there is a massive explosion of bureaucracy and kind of middle management jobs that are glorified sort of pencil pushing jobs for the sake. It's just another government job in some ways. It reminds me of the Soviet Union, where people just created jobs because no one could be unemployed. So you had ridiculous jobs where people were doing ridiculous things, but it was just to disguise the fact that they were just on welfare, So we're kind of doing that, and we're doing that through the mechanism that I described earlier, which is that certain industries will just not be allowed to fail, and so they can hire lots of, social media managers or whatever. Eventually, we'll all make money from just being on Instagram, I guess. That world, where is the meritocracy, and where is, how can you outperform? And then it's just an attention economy where the most radical thing somebody does and gets attention, gives you the clicks. I don't think that's necessarily good either. So we have to have a really broad rethink in terms of what we value as a society. And sadly, sometimes that happens it's only when you lose everything that you realize what you really want. I hope it doesn't get too, the austerity push is going to be quite significant. And I worry that we haven't seen even a fraction of what's coming yet.
It's also it made me think of the red tape part as well, the bureaucrats that you were mentioning, of this meme of, pretty sure you've seen it or heard of it, is the US innovates, China copies, and the EU regulates. And that is a bit of kind of the general feeling of, also when you look at Mario Draghi addressing that, saying that we need to remove all those red tapes to enable innovation to thrive. And
it's Europe's key export. It's regulation.
Yeah, I mean, look at GDPR, for example. What just a consequence of GDPR and all that. It actually was a big toll on what I understood and read on SMEs. They suffered the most, actually. As the big tech companies, it was just a compliance thing for them. But they have a huge department. And then EU every now and then fines them for a couple of hundreds of million for this and that, but it's not a big problem, and it does not actually solve what they tried to solve in the first place.
No, exactly. I think, I think ultimately Europe is best off looking to cut bureaucracy and allow a lot of small, medium-sized companies to come back into the market. I mean, Germany already has a lot of small, medium-sized companies. The Mittelstand, etc., is the middle tier. Obviously, is very famous, and we don't have the big cross-national and global companies, but we do have a lot of national champions within countries, right? So, what I'm suggesting is, at the moment, everybody wants to be a unicorn. I think we need to reassess what our objectives are, and it's fine to just have a medium-sized company. That is a massive accomplishment, and we should just encourage kids not to want to be Jeff Bezos, but to be a sort of really durable and value-adding small, medium-sized company where the owner has a nice life. He's not Jeff Bezos. He doesn't have a yacht, but he's got enough to have a really nice life. And I think that should be aspirational. That sort of middle, it's what used to be known as the American dream. The American dream used to be having the access to a middle-class existence. It's now somehow been twisted into like becoming a billionaire. That shouldn't be the aspirational dream, right? It should be just having enough to have a really nice life. And I think if we change that mindset amongst the younger people, Europe can exist in that world, because the real selling point of Europe is just having a nice life and having those long lunches and having good social health care and, knowing your neighbors and all that sort of stuff. That would be what we sell to the world, and becoming incredibly good at it. We would never compete in terms of all sorts of things, but does it really matter? I don't know. Maybe there are some areas that we can still compete on, and AI might be one of them. I just don't think it is. Probably sort of certain goods, very kind of specific national goods. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've misread the room, but like, do you get that impression that people just are no longer, there is no sort of championing of a middle class life?
I think I can relate of what you're saying, but I see more of the opposite happening, that the regulations and all that, just the structure of the economy is actually destroying the middle class. My grandparents, they're from Germany, and we have one of the oldest butcheries in Germany, and that's in the hands of my uncle. And he's going to be the last person actually being, leading that butchery, and it's more than 130 years old. And after him, it's over. And all the pressure that he has with regulations of the German state imposing more and more regulations, with inflation, with the cost of production being increasingly high, where he's not even able to pay himself anymore at some point. And also the big meat manufacturers that are basically getting imported, so from Argentina, New Zealand, all kinds of countries from around the world, competing with his local meat, local sourced and great quality, is also coming to an end. And it's kind of the end of craftsmanship as a whole, where in the end you'll end up just in a giant supermarket at Costco, whatever, and you get all the things there. And maybe what you're saying actually makes the most sense, is that maybe we don't have a unicorn, but an army of ponies.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I think that's exactly it. Like, why do we need to have hyper efficiency when the hyper efficiency is actually paradoxical to the thing that we do best, which is inefficiency? It's a paradox, because when you are, and the environmentalists will say, well, we can't sustain that sort of lifestyle. So that is the other issue, is like, we can't sustain that lifestyle and be environmental, but only if the demographics are problematic. But if we regulate the demographics, I think it is sustainable. I think we can possibly do that and be protected by the countries that do want to go down the hyper efficiency pathway, right? So the megapolises of China, etc. But I'm not necessarily convinced that model. I think, it's like a Tower of Babylon. When you get that level of hyperscaling, it's very fragile. And the beauty of the kind of distributed ponies is it's much more resilient in the long run. I think this is where China's anxiety is right now, is if it topples in a big way. They try to do these controlled implosions all the time, but those controlled implosions are now getting in the way of any sort of ambition within the younger generations. So you have that lying flat phenomenon where the kids just don't want to work. Like, what is the point of even going to work if you're not allowed to make any money? Because every time you put your money in any investment or whatever, it gets blown up. So, you're not allowed to be rich. You're not allowed, at the moment, there is this weird phenomenon where on YouTube, I mean, in some ways you could say that's an advocacy of the middle class system, but is it really middle class? It isn't, because what is aspirational is not the conventional idea of what is middle class. It's sort of a consumer society where you live in a flat and have, you have your Chinese EV car, whatever, but it's not necessarily just because of the demographics. I don't think everyone can have like a house and a garden and all the kind of stuff that Europe values, right? It's a different type of middle class existence. And I think even then you can't, because you're never going to get that sort of joie de vivre that you would get in France. You have to aspire to be a billionaire in China. Otherwise, what else is there to aspire to? It is clear that they can do absolutely incredible things at scale, but they too are facing a demographic issue. And when you have the weight of their size, of the size of their population, when you get an inverted pyramid, you're gonna have to, like, where are they gonna be able to top that older generation up? I don't know, because I don't see people rushing to immigrate to China. It would have to be robots or something. I don't know how they would do it.
Maybe move towards the final part of the conversation. I still wanted to discuss CBDCs and more specifically in the context of the future of Europe. Also the euro, the digital euro. It might enable the EU in general to achieve such kind of projects. What do you think about all that? How do you see this evolve, and how would you explain this?
I mean, the interesting thing about the CBDC system and the efforts to push it ahead right now is that a lot of countries that have been experimenting with it are sort of saying, well, maybe it's not for us after all. We've seen, I think, Canada step back a little bit and Australia step back, and having reviewed, whatever they did, like proof of concepts. I don't think they got to the proof of concept stage, but, the research showed there was no appetite for it, and maybe it doesn't make sense. The country that is really pushing ahead, like out of the G7, the one that is really pushing ahead with it more than any, not country, I mean, it's the European Union. So the digital euro legislatively is ahead of mostly all the other G20 countries. I think. I don't know what's going on with like Japan. Actually, I have to check in. But where, I mean, it's legislation on the. It's sort of preemptive legislation. Like at the end of the day, the decision will rest with the ECB. What are the real advantages? Well, in terms of the Draghi plan, I think you could theoretically sort of argue it could help centralization, and it could maybe help in the event of any supply shortages. I mean, it could sort of enhance a Gosplan style system where you move away from the price system as an indicator for supply and demand. I could see it many years from now going down that pathway in terms of allocation of capital. If we get into this sort of tiering of rates and certain repression for, like, so if you have industrial policy that represses certain sectors and elevates others based on some sort of political idea of what is going to drive growth and what isn't, then you could also see a CBDC at the wholesale level maybe being used to manage interest, different tiers of interest rates, right? I could see that maybe happening. On the retail level, I don't think it would really make a difference. But when you look at somewhere like the Soviet Union, of course, they had really 4 different currency zones at the time. They had like the ruble, for day-to-day transactions, and they had like a accounting ruble for internal like actual civil, like everyone worked for the state, but there was another sort of accounting ruble for direct sort of investments and at the bureaucratic government level. And then there was a cross-border Comic-Con ruble, trade ruble, so there were different rubles for different things. maybe you would get something similar like that via CBDC. My concern with the CBDC is that actually the main reason they are pushing for it is this idea of efficiency, and also because they want to, they don't like being under the yoke of Visa and MasterCard. They want their own internal payment system that doesn't need to go through those systems. They don't like being under the yoke of an American system. And they think the digital euro is the easiest and most efficient way of creating a challenger to Visa and MasterCard without having to do like some sort of equivalent, right? Because of the national champion issue. That I think is the main driving force for the digital euro. But in their heads, they think that the digital euro will be more cost efficient than Visa and MasterCard. And I'm not convinced that's necessarily going to be the case. And I think if they force merchants to take the digital euro, which is currently the question whether they're going to do that or not, they have to make it more, they have to at least make sure it's no more or less expensive than the alternatives. And at the moment, if it is, they're going to subsidize it. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, because if it's actually more expensive than Visa and MasterCard, and the state is subsidizing it to get their merchants to use it, is like that creates another like massive burden for the European Union system. I don't think it's necessarily a good one. The other question is like, who gets to use it? Is it just EU nationals? Is it just Eurozone nationals? Is it going to be like, what happens if, say, you go on, you're living in Australia and you want to use the euro? Like, will you be able to access it? These are all questions that have to be investigated as well. And at the moment, it's not very clear where those boundaries will lie. And there are obvious sort of anxieties if suddenly the digital euro is accessible to absolutely everybody in the world, or vice versa, or not vice versa. The digital pound, they already said in their main sort of, what was it called, one of their consultation papers, they said they see the digital pound being used, there's no barrier, anyone can use it anywhere in the world. But there is instead some sort of gentleman's agreement between G20 countries that they just will not, they will resist pushing it into each other's economies to make sure that, effectively the entire world can be a market for their respective digital CBDCs apart from fellow G20 countries. That's the gentleman's agreement. Now that's very interesting, because suddenly if you get like G20 CBDCs being used in China, because the yuan is like zero interest rate, and they've decided, I mean, at the moment, most of these currencies are seen as being zero. But say like suddenly they decide to put an interest rate on it, or give you a preferential interest rate for like certain conditions or whatever, then you can see, how's China going to appreciate if people are using VPNs to, store their wealth in digital pounds or digital euros. So that, or even worse than that, you could see them secretly servicing, British holidaymakers in China in pounds, not in yuan, and that undermines all the tourist dollars. So it's very interesting. It brings to light the opportunities in terms of selling and exporting your, monetary control outside of your borders. But at the same time, I suspect the retaliation will be geofencing of some sort, so that we'll come back to the world of capital controls, or at least forex controls, like there was in the 70s, where you had to declare your currency when you're going cross-border, right? So you could imagine, I totally imagine that like digitally that will be possible, where all your, when you get to China, your digital euro wallets just won't be usable. You'll have to do an official conversion into digital.
So it would be like a digital currency war in a way, or like an arbitrage game.
It'll be like I think it will be a supply chain war, actually, because when you think about it, if you have why I say supply chain war, because if you have let's break it down to the most easy kind of thought experiment. So if I'm here in the UK and prices are going up, there is some sort of massive shortage of goods and the sterling is not stable anymore, but the yuan is being managed in a better way and is a good store of value, right? I might be inclined to put my money in the yuan. Now, at the moment, without the digital euros, whatever, I can do that through the Forex markets, whatever, but I can't really spend those yuans here. Like, no one will take them. But if I suddenly have an yuan wallet and I have the capacity to engage in payments like WeChat or whatever, and I go to Chinatown and all those Chinese vendors who have all their supply chains from China, and because they're being serviced by China, they can afford, whereas British vendors are selling bread at increasingly higher prices, the Chinese, because they're supplied by China, they can give you a discount, but under the counter, if you pay in yuan, it doesn't ever touch HM revenue, HMRC, because as far as it's like an extraterritorial transaction just happening on our territory, but everything is Chinese goods and immediately transacted for yuan. Effectively doesn't see the, how would you even detect it outside of very strict import-export controls, which obviously still exists, but you can see the opportunity for smuggling and you can see the opportunity for like digital and virtual goods, especially that can transcend actual export controls, right? So then you have quite a problem on your hands, right? So people are spending their money, they're almost living in a parallel economy, transacting in yuan whilst living under the sovereignty of the UK. And mainly because there is an arbitrage in terms of doing that, because the store of value of the yuan is better in that scenario than the local equivalent. And so then I can, on the black market, exchange my yuan. They've held value better, and I can get more goods when I do engage with the British economy. That's very destabilizing. That is not optimal for it's very similar again to what happened in Soviet Union when you saw the dollar markets penetrate and infiltrate the local economies.
Yeah, so it would be, but same in China. China also has currency control, right? So you can also not own more than I think $5,000. And it's also in China and in Europe soon. They also talk about the Digital Identity Act, I think, or the Digital European Identity Sport, where all your assets, your identity, the digital euro would all be tied to. So then there will be also the KYC component where you might not be able to just do what you described, because depending on the digital currency that you would be using, you would basically be flagged based on maybe geolocation or...
It's very subjective, like, and going right back to our original conversation, like KYC only matters if the state chooses to act, right? So like when you look at China, there's an entire sector called Macau where all sorts of bad practice is tolerated quite strategically because it serves the interests of the Chinese to have certain pockets of non-control for obscuring, this whole purple economy where there is an incentive for strategic reasons to tolerate it. And if the strategic interest of the Chinese at this point is to undermine the UK economy by allowing British people to use as much yuan as possible, then you could imagine that suddenly KYC is not that much of a problem and the limits go up because it's strategic. And with a CBDC that is linked to geolocation, you can do all of that, because it depends what your strategic interest. Like it really heightens the it turns money into, it weaponizes money. I mean, we that term is used a lot, but it weaponizes it in a way where on a very bespoke level. So suddenly you don't, it really depends where your circumstances are what your circumstances are and where you are dictates how much value your wallets have and how far they can go. And it's to do with what because the ultimate keeper of your system dictates is their policy agenda. But this is no different. Happened in the 70s. Like, you had similar kind of wars. It's just it was in manual, declare your exchange here when you come in, and once the difference is that once you were in, you either had your money taken away from you, or you had to declare it, and it was limited in some way, or it had to be exchanged for other sort of goods, other tokens.
Thanks a lot, Izabella. It's been a great pleasure to finally talk to you, and I hope that we have another opportunity in the future to cover other topics. Do you have any maybe last remarks that you want to share?
No, I think it's been a very far-ranging discussion. I always caveat everything with the point that I don't have the answers, and I'm responding to what is in the public domain as much as anybody else. So let's see how my predictions or my analysis stacks up in a year's time or whatever. I'm open to being wrong, is what I'm trying to. No, I don't have any superior insight, really. It's just how I see the world at the moment, but it could change.
Yeah, definitely. And as you also mentioned in a lot of other interviews and what you say online is always be curious and be remaining critical of the information that you dissect. So exactly. I think that's an important factor of that. Thanks a lot for your time and knowledge.
Don't be afraid to change your mind if the facts change.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Leave your actions down below in the comment section. And if you want to watch more videos, feel free to check the most recent video, but also any other video that we've had published on the channel before. See you next time.